What mysticism means to me primarily is the experience of awe and the opening of the heart that happens when we experience awe. And I think it's interesting that the first etymological meaning of mysticism is to enter the mysteries. When we enter mysteries like the mysteries of the universe, the mysteries of the wonder of the microcosm or the macrocosm, of nature, of ourselves, there's an awe experience, there's an opening of the heart. And I think this is why we need you scientists to help us to experience awe. I think there's something happening today in science in terms of the wonders of cosmology and the universe opening up. And frankly, I think this is why there's so many scientists who are being struck by awe and turning mystical. I say there are more scientists who are mystics today than bishops.
A lot of people, if you ask them enough questions, you can find a moment when they had an experience of awe as a child, which is something that made them want to be a scientist. I had several. I was very, very interested in animals as a child, and I remember one of the things that fascinated me was homing pigeons. I used to go with my father to the local railway sidings, where every Saturday morning hundreds of baskets of pigeons came from all over England, and the porters at the station, at a fixed time, they'd take out their pocket watch at the right time, they'd release them, they'd open these, and the pigeons would fly up into the sky, head off in all different directions all over Britain. And I used to help them open these baskets and release these pigeons, and I was just fascinated by the birds themselves and how they found their way. I think, though, when people get absorbed in writing grant applications and in day-to-day life in the laboratory, or recedes into the background, and there's something in the spirit of modern science which, on the one hand, has opened up whole new perspectives for wonder, but there's something about the spirit in which it's done that rather diminishes wonder. You know, it says all that stuff's just sort of stuff from the past, we've now figured it out. As soon as you think we're so clever because we've figured it all out, it does have an awe-diminishing effect. And instead of a recognition of that greater interconnectedness, which I think the mystic state is about, it's about a feeling of connection to something greater than oneself, not just an idea, but an experience of that connection. I think that for many practicing scientists, that doesn't happen very much on a daily basis in the lab, but maybe it doesn't happen very much on a daily basis for most people.
Well, I think it's true that our capacity for awe, I think, is perhaps the greatest when we're young, and that gradually with the onslaught of responsibilities, problem solving, education, and often, unfortunately, religion, that childlike capacity in us gets somewhat squelched. But I think what the mystics all promise is that meditation, there are ways through meditation and so forth to recover this sense of the child awakening, and therefore to see all of life as mystery, as you say, all of life is interconnected, and to experience the unitive impulse of things. And I think that is the mystical experience, is that of the unitive experience. For example, many parents will tell me that their greatest mystic experience of their life is being present and alert when the child is born, or, of course, when we're with people we love who die. That too can be a very profound unitive experience of life, death, the ancestors, the future. I think, therefore, that mysticism is a daily event for those who are alert and have not squelched their child entirely.
I think it can be. I think many people have mystical experiences, and in fact, recent surveys that have happened in Britain and America show that it's much commoner. It's not just something that happened to a few people in the past that you read about in books, but something which is quite common among ordinary people. And what they're talking about now there is these particular moments of insight which have changed their lives. A lot of people who've had these experiences say they've changed their lives. And I think it's at least 10% of the population in Britain that have had these, according to these surveys.
I think it's 75% in the United States, but according to...
maybe a different criterion, but it's a very high proportion. I mean, it's much higher than you'd think.
Yes.
And quite a lot of those experiences are to do with nature. People who've had these feelings at sunsets in beautiful places, on mountains, with trees, with animals. Another thing that's emerged from these surveys is that people are extremely shy at talking about these things. And one of the people who studied them in England at the Religious Experience Research Unit in Oxford, where they've surveyed people and collected thousands of accounts, is that many people have never told anyone, not even their nearest and dearest. One of the people said that who studied this said that there's a taboo against mysticism in our society, rather comparable to the taboo against sex in the Victorian era. And it's fine to talk about sex now, but it's not fine at all to talk about mysticism, because people are afraid that they'll be thought to be mad.
So I met a rabbi this year who told me he was in the seminary in the 70s, and he kept asking his professors, teach us about our mystical tradition, teach us about our mystical tradition. And they said, shut up, we're dealing with serious theology here. Finally, they screamed at him and said, we have no mystical tradition. Judaism has no mystical tradition. Well, of course, that's utterly absurd. These are people with PhDs in their left brain, but not much happening in their right. So what the fellow did was he graduated from the seminary, and he went to India to live with Rajneesh for 3 years to find some mysticism. And I think that is so incredible because, of course, the Jewish tradition is very rich in mysticism with the wisdom writings in the Bible, with the Hasidic tradition, and of course with the Kabbalah. But to think that he had rabbinic professors telling him that we have no mystical tradition is simply proof of Rosak's observation that academia, especially, has been very, very hard on mystics, and even embarrassed by them, if you will.
Actually happens when you see a Monet or something beautiful? What happens within you that you would describe it as a mystical experience?
Well, I think part of every experience of awe is an experience of being struck and being without words. They say that ineffability is part of a mystical experience. Therefore, you are struck by silence. You know, I think every experience of awe is wrapped in an experience of silence. And you realize that you've encountered something greater than yourself, and yet you are encountering it. There is a true subject-subject relationship going on between you. And so it's not just an object relationship, it's an enveloping, it's a kind of being brought into the world of, the mind of, the grace of the maker of whatever this being that we encounter is. mysticism has, I think, essentially four directions. One is the direction of awe and wonder. And in an experience of awe, you are connecting. So it's a deep connection. You're connecting in a positive way, a way of delight and joy. Well, the via positiva, by its very name, the positive way, is the way of affirmation, the way of delight and joy, wonder. Awe always includes, I think, a sense of deep pleasure and ecstasy. And people have these ecstasies in nature. They have them in experiences of art, music, and so forth. We have them in friendship and relationships. We have them in sexual experience. We have them in our work, hopefully. We have them in study. I know for my part, some of my greatest ecstasies have been in studying, reading, and learning with the insights that others have, and you say, oh, that's beautiful, or I've had that experience, and so on. So Meister Eckhart says, for the person who is awake, a breakthrough, or what I would call ecstasy, does not happen once a year, once a month, once a week, or once a day, but many times every day. That we can expect that we will be struck by awe every time we wake up. And that, you know, is, that's indigenous spirituality the world over, that the universe is constantly blessing us and striking us, and that's why there's no reason for being bored.
The challenge or problem is to be in the right state of mind, isn't it? Because there's so much beauty around us every day. I mean, in plants, in leaves, in the clouds, in the things we see around us.
In our breath.
Yes. In our breath, yes. That the problem is to retain that awareness, that openness to it. And sometimes it comes spontaneously. Sometimes it comes through meditation. I mean, meditation can help to stop that flow of thoughts or to quieten down the mind that blocks these things out. But the barriers seem to be within ourselves. Our own thoughts, preoccupations, and obsessions are what stop us being open to these things which can flood in and fill us with joy and wonder. But most of the time they don't, because we're so busy blocking them out.
That's right. But another dimension to the via positiva is what I call the contemplative, or what I'd call the cool ecstasies, the blue-green ecstasies, as distinct from the red and orange ecstasies, the more peaceful ecstasies. And these may happen, you know, at nighttime especially, I think. Just going to bed at night, or the quiet of nighttime, or getting up early in the morning, or reading with a candle, or praying with a candle, meditating on a simple phrase from scripture, from a poet or a mystic, of course. Reading the mystics is something we haven't talked very much about here, but it's a wonderful way to develop your own mysticism, is to read Rumi, and not read them in terms of getting through a book. But the way to read a mystic is you read until you're struck. Then you put the book down, and you play in your heart with this beautiful idea. For example, here's Rumi. He says, beyond the idea of good and the idea of evil, there lies a field. I will meet you there. It's a wonderful phrase. And it encourages us to know that true living is not just about ethics, morality, and immorality, as important as that is. It's also about this field that's beyond morality and immorality. It's about transcendence. It's about union.
We use nature to enhance our own mystical experiences. Do you think that there is ecstasy and ritual in nature? Do animals have ecstatic experiences?
I have no doubt that animals have ecstatic experiences, but first I want to say that we are nature too. I think there's a real problem sometimes in our language that we're not there yet in realizing that humanity is 15 billion years of nature. But I know when I lived in the countryside for several years, the ducks would always line up when the sun was setting and go out and watch the sunset. And it was quite amazing, and they weren't the only ones. And I've read stories about how bears watch sunsets. And this book, When Elephants Weep, is real revelatory because it has gathered a lot of the scientific documentation and documentation from observers of all kinds of wildlife about the fact that animals do indeed have an inner life. And of course, Rupert is doing some very important and groundbreaking scientific research on that subject himself, so I'm sure he has a lot to say. But I know this, that I was very close to my dog for 17 years, and he taught me not only the importance of ecstasy, but how guiltless one should be in the presence of ecstasy. That I think that's one of the great lessons we have to learn from animals, is their capacity for joy.
I think there are many things about the natural world which show a kind of aesthetic sense, and I think probably the most, well, there are two things I should say. Firstly, in the animal kingdom, animals appreciate each other's beauty. And as Charles Darwin showed, you can only understand the evolution, for example, of the peacock in terms of what he calls sexual selection. Peahens like peacocks with beautiful tails, and the one with the most beautiful tail tends to get the most attractive peahen. And this, as a form of natural selection, it's really based on an aesthetic preference. Bowerbirds, who make these amazing displays of leaves and flowers, beautiful displays to court females. The one that makes the most beautiful work of art, a kind of collage of things picked up from the environment, gets the woman. I mean, it's sexual selection is a powerful force for aesthetics in the animal kingdom, and in many species of animals and birds and so on. And then when we look at the plant kingdom, the aesthetics of flowers are precisely because they're beautiful. The flowers are designed to appeal to animal eyes. Flowers were attractive to animals long before humans came on the scene. There have been flowers on flowering plants for at least 100 million years, human beings for maybe 1 or 2 million years. So why were these flowers there? As Charles Darwin said, there would have been no flower until there was an eye to see it. That flowers are precisely there because they attract animals, mainly insects. And the insects are drawn to the flower, they're drawn to its shape, its color, they're affected by its perfume. Moths are drawn to perfume flowers at night, and so on. So the aesthetics of flowers are to do with the communication between the plant and the animal kingdoms, and they make no sense without an eye to see them and appreciate them. So I think there are many ways in which nature reveals beauty, not just incidentally, something that we read into nature through the way we look at it, but something which is intrinsic to the way things are in the natural world. The blackbird, for example, the English blackbird, has the most wonderful song, as do many other birds, but the reason they sing like that is because other blackbirds like it. And when you hear blackbirds singing in the spring, this wonderful melody, other blackbirds will respond to them. It's a form of communication, but it goes way beyond mere functional exchange of signals. It's a great exploration of the aesthetics of sound that we can find in birdsong. And so I think that the aesthetic sense is certainly not confined to human beings. And insofar as beauty, it points beyond itself. It points to a kind of mystical experience, the aesthetic experience. We could say that this is deeply embedded in the natural world.
And I think it's so important to realize that you compare the aesthetics, the diverse, the rich, luxurious beauty of this planet to the moon, for example, or even to Mars. There's a beauty there in terms of the color, but the diversity, of course, is not there in terms of living things. And you realize how spoiled we are. And again, how much are we taking for granted, especially in terms of the destruction that we're doing of this uniquely beautiful and diversely beautiful, richly, luxuriously beautiful planet. And I think that a lot of our forms of worship in the West have fallen into vicarious prayer because the modern age gave us this archetype of the printing press, where the people actually are sitting in churches like you would be sitting on a printing press row, a row of type, and everything is engineered to be the same. It's interesting, for example, people in modern churches have to have a crying room for the babies. But we notice at our Technocosmic Mass, as I've noticed at indigenous worship, the babies don't need a crying room. It's very natural for babies to be held while their parents are dancing. And people bring babies to our Technomass. There's never any crying. There's never any disruption. They're as happy as everybody else. It's just very amazing to me. But it's typical that as long as we're stuck in benches, we're all uncomfortable. And the babies are honest enough to tell us how they're feeling.
I think it's obviously a matter of striking a balance, isn't it, between having elements from the past that give the ritual its power, its connection with the ancestors, which is an essential feature of ritual, and something which engages people, that prevents a kind of boredom setting in. I like traditional forms of worship. I'm much more in favour of regular forms of worship than you are, Matt. I actually enjoy them, and one of the kinds of service I enjoy most is choral evensong in England, in the evenings, every day in the great cathedrals of England. The choir sings this wonderful service, usually with fantastic polyphonic music, the old forms of prayer, which for me is a wonderfully moving and powerful experience. And it's not for everybody, as you can see by the very small numbers of people who attend these fantastic services. Most people don't even know they're going on. There's a need always, I think, to find new forms of ritual, but it's interesting that when people are innovating in ritual, when they're developing new forms of ritual, they very rarely say, this is totally new. They nearly always say, this is recapturing the original spirit. They nearly always claim that, in fact, it's deeply conservative. Even you, Matt, with your techno-rave masses where people are dancing a lot, you refer back to a much more ancient pattern of worship in which people did dance. So, although the technology you use, multimedia and so on, is new, there are many elements which are archaic.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely,
Yes.
especially dance.
Yes.
And it's indigenous, too. I mean, it gets back to our pre-modern roots.
Well, it's indigenous everywhere, isn't it? I mean, dancing as an expression of collective activity is found in every part of the world.
Except where certain Christian missionaries stepped, you know. I mean, you can...
Well, they
I
exported
run into Native Americans who tell me that they were taught at the reservation by Baptist ministers, number one, to get rid of their language and their worship, and number three, never to dance.
Well, this is exporting the sort of the perversions of culture, at least the diminution. I shouldn't say perversion, I should say the constrictions, the narrowness that have come to us as part of the Puritan heritage.
Yes.
The Puritan heritage has great strengths. It's a kind of focus of purification. I mean, there's great strength in it, but there's a narrowness too, in that it restricts and narrows down.
Sure, but I think it's part of the Cartesian heritage too, the idea that our soul is in the pineal gland, and so dance then, which takes place lower in our chakras, is unimportant.
Yes, it's
not
lower and
a gateway to the soul at all.
Yes, quite. Well, I like very much the American essayist Wendell Berry has a wonderful thing about the history of dance, where he says in traditional societies, the whole society dances together.
Sure.
Then, after the sort of industrial society came in, the society splits up and people dance in pairs.
Nuclear
It's just
family there.
The nuclear family.
dancers.
And in the modern world, they dance alone. So,
Well, we've been talking really about mysticism as awe, what the mystics would say, the via positiva. But of course, there's a dark side, a shadow side that opens up the mystical heart too, I think, and that is the experience of suffering and breakdown and chaos and, well, the experience of nothingness. A lot of people have this experience. And, for example, people in AA whose whole lives get shattered and then they start over again, many of them will say that this is a beginning of their mystical life, their utter bottoming out. And the mystics write about that, how the breakdown becomes the breakthrough. So I think that's another dimension to mystical experience that is available to everyone, that experience of the heart breaking. Joanna Macy says when your heart breaks, the universe can flow through. When your heart breaks, the universe flows through. Something bigger happens very often when the heart breaks. Your heart literally can grow. And I think that acknowledging and finding rituals and ways of entering into this grief and into this darkness is a very real part of the mystical path as well. The mystics call it the dark night of the soul, they call it the via negativa. And I think science today too is beginning to rediscover or discover really the black holes in the universe just as they're in our psyche, and how pregnant these are, how fertile and important these are for activity that's going around in the light.
well, I don't know how much of that would be mystical, but it's certainly the same principle that transformation depends on breaking or blocking the old habits. And most of the great creative moments in the history of the universe are ones of destruction and dissolution. For example, if there hadn't been an appalling catastrophe about 60 million years ago when the asteroid hit the Earth somewhere near the Yucatan Peninsula and changed the climate all around the world, killing 75% of all species, including all the dinosaurs. If that enormous catastrophe had not occurred, we'd still be dinosaurs. I mean, this program would need much larger studio to be filmed. You know, the
No
creatures
mammals.
around. There'd be no mammals, or only a few, no bigger than the chicken. That there was a tremendous creativity on Earth after the extinction of the dinosaurs. The mammals evolved from fairly undifferentiated ancestors to give most of the families we have today. So you could say that in the history of evolution, it's through death, destruction, and catastrophe that you get these huge bursts of creativity. I wouldn't know whether that was a mystical experience or merely an analogy to it. I don't suppose the dinosaurs felt particularly mystical as the skies darkened, the earth went cold, and death and destruction were on every side. But there was a sense in which that created the conditions for this huge creative evolution of the mammals. When stars burst, when a supernova explodes, there was one in 1987, a huge supernova explosion, the biggest since the beginning of the 17th century. It was in the southern hemisphere, so we didn't see it here. That explosion of the star releases elements of things like iron and carbon and so forth. The things of which the Earth is made is stardust, and it's only through the explosion of stars, through destruction, that creation can occur.
Well, I hear you speaking of what Christians would call the Paschal Mystery. We're talking now about the life, death, and resurrection of matter of all kinds. But the psyche, too, goes into the the darkness. And of course, in our culture, we're always being invited not to go into the darkness, to numb ourselves from the pain through addiction, whether it be alcohol, drugs, television, shopping, sports, or what have you. And so we're kind of denying ourselves the real invitation to go into our own depths. You know, another etymological meaning for mysticism is to shut the senses, to close the senses. And a kind of a guilt-based theological ideology will say this is about mortifying the senses and killing them off because they're so provocative and unable to be controlled. But in creation spiritual tradition, shutting the senses means something like pulling the plug in your television set and going out for a walk, or going into the wilderness, where we have all had the experience that your senses get clarified, they get cleansed, and there's an emptying going on. Or it means doing a Zen meditation, or a meditation where you calm your images and your intake of sense perception. Not that senses are bad, but precisely in order to be more appreciative of them and to get them more into shape. Eckhart says, be bare of all images and bare of all mind. And he says, and experience the not God and the not person and the not image. So even our images of God, it's about ceasing to project. And this is something that the mystic learns in order to get into the heart arena. So Quakers know a lot about this. Monks who meditate, anyone who meditates, knows about the path of silence. Rumi, right, the great Sufi mystic of the Middle Ages, a contemporary of Eckhart, writes a lot about silence. He says, I'm looking for the secrets of the mysteries of the world. And then he says, someone said to me, shh, silence will tell you about the secrets of the mysteries of the world. The other root of mysticism, or this is called the via negativa, is the direction of pain and darkness and things falling apart, chaos, the breakdown. And this happens, check it out with people in AA, for example. I mean, this is very practical in our culture. The bottoming out experience of pain, suffering when your heart breaks.
But there's a sense in which all of us experience this darkness, this silence, this closing of the senses every night when we go to sleep. Because although we've got lights on blazing in our cities, there's TV going on 24 hours a day, no one's managed to abolish sleep yet. And so this is still something we do.
Someone's working on it.
Yes. But there's a kind, all of us dip into this realm where all the normal concepts, barriers disappear. And indeed, in our sleep, we dream, whether we remember our dreams or not. And for many people, dreams are an opening to a whole other world of experience, imagery, and so on.
Absolutely. And the universe and the spirit and the whole tradition of how the angels come to us in dreams, as it did for Joseph and all kinds of biblical figures. The whole idea that great intuition and creativity comes to us in our dreams.
So do you think that dreams would, well, some dreams would probably count as mystical experiences, many of them would not, but what would make the difference between a dream, since we all dream, that would verge on the mystical or actually be a mystical experience?
Well, I think Jesus' criterion isn't bad at all when he says, by their fruits you'll know them. So if our dreams really affect us in a deep way, so it becomes transformative. And of course, for that, we do, remembering them is pretty primary, or at least unconsciously being affected by them. But I would say yes, to the extent that dreams really touch us, move us, awaken us, challenge us, heal us, and transform us. All those are elements of healthy dream life. And I couldn't agree more. When you think about it too, in terms of people who love each other and sleep together, you have to ask, there's a tradition of Native people of the medicine wheel, where you gather together and you ask the spirit for a dream, and then you sleep in the form of a wheel, and you have a group dream. Now one can ask, during this period of anti-mysticism, has marriage suffered? Because we have people who love each other not sleeping really in depth together in terms of their potential for dreaming together or for entering the realms where the spirit wanders, as you say, when we're not in the control that we're in, when we're living through the light of the day. Maybe we need some group mystical dream therapy to keep some of our marriages together and lower our divorce rate a little bit.
I think the thing that's most striking about this is that there's this incredible creativity, human creativity, all the art and music and so forth, all the cultural artifacts, the creativity of biological life that we see in the great diversity of plants and animals, the creativity of the cosmos that we see when we look up at night to the stars, and then all that's revealed through radio telescopes and so forth that's beyond what we can see with our naked eyes. Yet, most of the time, we really don't pay attention, do we? I think that the inspiration, the mystical inspiration that can come from this is something we just blind ourselves to. We're so busy worrying.
We take it for granted.
We take it for granted, and we're so busy with our own small concerns.
Yes.
And maybe this relates to what you were saying about the negative path, the via negativa, the pain and suffering, because one of the things those do is stop us taking things for granted. And there are other ways of waking up, other ways of seeing what's there, but that's one of them.
Yes. Other ways of learning to pay attention. But you're right, of course, a death experience, the death of someone we love, or facing our own death and disease or something, so often teaches us not to take for granted, not to take breath for granted. I remember visiting a friend who had AIDS, and he had a respiratory problem, and we went walking from his hospital room to a ledge, and we sat down, and a man was running down the street. And this fellow with AIDS said to me, "Imagine that, running." There was such a statement about taking breath for granted. And this is why so many meditation traditions around the world tell us to pay attention to the breath. I mean, this is rather basic thing not to take for granted. The first thing that happens when we enter the world, and the last thing we do when we leave, is to breathe. So you'd hope that in between you might not altogether forget the holiness of the breath. And then, of course, the teaching of Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century said prayer is nothing but inhaling and exhaling the one breath of the universe, Ruah, or Spirit of God. So the teaching that the breath we take is the divine breath, which, of course, is becoming, what shall I say, I think more and more awesome with a scientist's revelation, that if I take a deep breath here in Toronto, Canada, I am breathing in at least one molecule that Jesus Christ breathed while he was on earth, or that Muhammad breathed, or Buddha, that we're already inhaling one another. This is evidence of our interconnectivity, isn't it?
There's one other thing that I think it lies in traditional religions that can speak to us today, and that's fasting. I know this is more related to the ascetic tradition, that you're not so keen on.
Negative. It's letting go.
Yes, but I think this is a greatly underappreciated thing. I mean, all traditions have it. In the Muslims in Ramadan, the Hindus have fasting periods. We have fasting in the Christian tradition, of course, in Lent. And I think that there's a great need for this. It's a kind of counteraction to consumerism. It serves to block the habits of consumption that we so get enmeshed in, particularly in the modern world. I think it's a greatly underexploited resource, as it were, of the religious traditions. In England, you know, many Christians, if they give up anything for Lent, might give up the odd chocolate bar. But having lived in India among people who take fasting seriously, I was very impressed by the way it is a kind of discipline. And it's not just a bodily discipline, it creates a shift in spiritual awareness and consciousness. I suspect that some of the eating disorders we see, particularly among girls, like anorexia, are related to some kind of misplaced asceticism in some way. And so I think that there's a great deal to be said for recovering this tradition of altering of consciousness through bodily means. And drugs are one means. You take a drug and your consciousness changes. Another way is through fasting, and this is much safer. But medical people are rather shy of it. I think it would be the best beneficial thing if everyone went on fasts. There's very little medical research on it. Doctors are frightened of it because they haven't been taught about it in medical school. Priests, in my experience, are not too well up on the physiology of fasting. But this is an area where research and practice could, I think, help us all. I myself, because I'm a Christian and follow a Christian path, I find Lent is a very useful period for this. I always give up alcohol for Lent as a way of stopping a form of psychoactive drug and just seeing the change in consciousness that happens. And I also try to give up food for a week. I usually spend a week not eating anything. And I think that the effect of this is to make one appreciate food a great deal more when you get back to it, to shift consciousness in a very interesting way. And I think it's probably very good for one medically, physiologically. But I'm amazed at how few people in the West take fasting seriously, and it has a huge advantage in that it's free. So here's something that I think we could pay a lot more attention to, and would be a very practical way to alter consciousness through physiological means, unless one's got a rare medical condition, at no risk, at no cost, and in accordance with tradition.
Definitely. And it's a cleansing experience in so many ways. That's a very good point. And but you know, how you approach it is between asceticism and creation spirituality. Creation spirituality is all for fasting. That's via negativa, letting go and emptying. But it's not about hating food, you see. Whereas the ascetic approach would say you fast because food is a temptation, or food is evil or something. Now, one thing that I think the West, especially I'd say Europe, and certainly England, is very big on at this time, is what traditionally is called abstinence, and what we today call vegetarianism, for example, or semi-vegetarianism. The movement from a meat diet, or at least a red meat diet, to lesser meat is terribly important on so many levels in our culture today. First of all, as John Robbins has pointed out, if North Americans alone were to cut back 10% in our meat consumption, 60 million people could eat who are starving around the world because of the immense amount of land and water and grain it takes to feed our cattle addictions. But even more importantly is, I mean, so many young people today have chosen vegetarianism or semi-vegetarianism. And I think, frankly, this does make a difference in consciousness. It makes a difference in our relationship to animals and to others and those who are starving. And I think that there is some, but I'd like to see much more scientific evidence that it's healthier for the body. I think many people have real spiritual experiences when they're sick. For example, even being in the hospital, it's very alienating. It's the last place in the world a normal person would want to be, and yet you want to take advantage of it. This is what the mystics all teach about suffering, that it is a school that can teach us wisdom and can teach us some compassion. And so whenever you're in an alienating place, and of course, why is it that so many great figures have spent time in jail? Gandhi, Jesus, Paul, so many people go through a purgation period. Martin Luther King Jr., Mandela, Nelson Mandela, the purification that takes place in prison, Dorothy Day, these people, I think it's not a coincidence. They're not just in there because they've angered the wrong people, although that is the efficient cause. They're in there because, in addition to that, something transpires in their soul. And so I think that we're all capable of volunteering, really, to pull ourselves out from certain staid relationships at times in order to get a different perspective on things. Here's just one example. I know this relates to the fasting idea, but a Native American once taught me, he said, how do you learn the sacredness of water? You go without it for 3 days. And then when you return to water, the first sip is just very, very sacred. Now, it's a very simple lesson of not taking for granted. And I think that lesson applies not only to water and food, but to all our relations.
Fresh water to cool the earth. Fresh water to cool the road of life.
There is a time for fasting, for consciously withdrawing from what we take for granted.
But a lot of suffering isn't consciously chosen, is it? It's something imposed on us. When somebody dies, when there's an accident, someone loses a child, a loved one, and so on. A lot of grieving and loss, a lot of sickness, illness, in fact practically all of it, happens to people. And we have a choice in the way we respond to it. But we often have very little choice about what actually happens. So what you seem to be saying to me is that when these things happen, which destroy our old patterns, which stop us taking for granted any longer what we've taken for granted before, the mystical dimension comes in through our ability to respond to it. And we may not see that side of it straight away. I mean, maybe long periods of despair and darkness first. But the only way out, really, would be by seeing a greater hope or something that lies beyond. Is that what you're saying, that this creates the condition in which a larger picture can be emerged?
Yes, but we also, I think, need the instruction that the darkness is itself a path for a while. And often there is no hope at first. It's just day by day that one walks this path in the dark, not knowing if there will be any hope beyond. But there are rituals that we can do to carry us through. There's one ritual that I learned from a shaman of beating a drum daily and wailing from the guts. Because, as he said, when you beat a drum, you're riding the horse into the land of grief. And so to do this kind of meditation daily when you're in a great grief state can be very, very useful for staying in touch. You see, our natural response to suffering and pain is to run from it. This is why I think we're set up for the medical establishment's idea of giving us Prozac or something. But the mystical tradition would more likely say, go into the darkness, go into the pain, and learn what's there for you. And if we're able to do that, especially with some kind of form or ritual, then you do come out at the other end eventually. But I don't think we can blithely promise that there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think people really have to eat the darkness of that tunnel. Mechtilde Magdeburg, the 13th century mystic, describes it powerfully when she says there are times when the lantern of beauty goes out and the memory of the light of the lantern goes out, and even the memory of the beauty of the lantern goes out. She named the dark night of the soul 200 years before John of the Cross did. And those are realities in people's lives, but the question is, how do we deal with the darkness? How do we teach one another to deal with the darkness? And I do think that the modern culture, with its emphasis on light and enlightenment, did not instruct us well in terms of The fact that the universe can absorb our pain, number one, and number two, that darkness really has a lot to teach us. It's as if we've been on a path of banishing darkness with all these cities and all these lights and so forth. And even the television is a light machine. And I think that we almost have to go out of our way today to find the darkness again as a friend and as a place of instruction, a school.
I was very struck when I was living in India by the way that the darkness, the divine side of the darkness, is represented in their religious imagery, particularly in the form of the goddess Kali, whose very name means the black one. And Kali is this black, she's the destructive aspect of the mother. All great goddess cultures recognize that mothers are not just nurturing and so on, but they have this destructive side of Mother Nature too, to do with death and suffering. And Kali is shown there with skulls dangling from her belt, her fangs dripping with blood, holding a knife and so on. She's very clearly a terrifying figure. And this recognition of the terrifying, the dark side of the divine, I think is very important in Indian culture for the way that they deal with. Most Indians have a lot more suffering of the most obvious kind than we do in the West, with various forms of social security and reasonable levels of prosperity and stuff, and famine, starvation, cruel deaths, infant mortality. These have been the lot of many people there for much longer than they have here, and even today in a much more extreme form. And Kali gives an image that people can look at and see an image of suffering and destruction, which promises that there's something beyond, because Kali destroys but also prepares the way for creation.
Meister Eckhart says the ground of the soul is dark. Very powerful image. If we're going to get into the ground, we're going to get into our lower chakras, and we're going to get into the depths of our inner life, as you pointed out, darkness will be what's there. And the whole idea, therefore, of praying in the darkness is very powerful and very important. Again, it's one of the powerful things in the Technomass, that the place is dark except for the light that the media can shed on the walls. But essentially, to get the community praying together, you see, when prayer was identified with reading the text, it had to be in the light. You had to have the lights on. But again, part of doing a sweat lodge's power is that you're in the dark together. And or in terms of a powwow dance out at midnight, you're in the dark together. And there's a great beauty, a great wonder about that. And of course, the whole tradition, if you have the Song of Songs, that lovers do their thing in the dark, that we are conceived in the dark. I mean, great things happen in the dark. But our culture, and especially I would say our religiously trained leaders, so-called, are not trained in the tradition of mysticism and mystery. And that's part of, the meaning of the word mysticism, that idea of shutting the senses. In the dark, of course, many of your senses have to just kind of be calm and wait around. And that makes you more vulnerable, I think, to transcendence, and allows mystery to arise more. When I was a kid, I loved Gregorian chant, and part of it was the darkness. That is to say, I didn't know the Latin, so I was not confused. I wasn't yearning to get the words and the meaning of the words. You were able to settle more into the beauty of the chant and the rhythm. There was a kind of darkness there because the curiosity of the left brain, if you will, was silenced for a while.
Well, in practical terms, we can achieve a certain measure of darkness simply by shutting our eyes, which many people do when they pray or meditate. But then it's not that difficult to arrange to be in a dark place. And I wonder, what have you done in practical terms to explore the role of darkness for prayer or meditation? Getting away from books and the things which we normally have in rituals based on words.
Well, one of the most beautiful experiences of darkness I've had occurred when I attended a Sundance at the Lakota Reservation in Rosebud, South Dakota. And it was quite late at night, and we did a sweat lodge. Then exited from the sweat lodge, and there was this most incredible vision of the Milky Way I've ever seen before or since. It ran like a rainbow from one corner of the earth all the way across the sky like this. And of course your senses literally get purified in a sweat lodge. So you came out and I was just stunned by, I'd never seen so many stars, I'd never seen the Milky Way so pronounced, and I'd never seen it so clear. So that for me was a very wondrous, aesthetic, awesome, amazing, radical amazement, as Heschel calls mysticism, radically awakened moment for me.
What about the experiences of despair, depression? Going into suffering.
Yeah. Well, I know I was once going through a deep grief experience, and I was just in the dark for months. And two things kind of, it started to get me move a little. One was to image what I was feeling, and the image that I had was falling down this well. But the well was an infinite well. I was continuing to fall. It was totally dark. But I kept with that image, and after a while, there were pictures of people I admired on the wall as I fell. They didn't stop the fall, but they were a bit of a light. So I remember Meister Eckhart's picture and someone else's picture and someone else's picture. So that was the beginning of some hope returning. And then I started to draw what I was seeing, drawing the well and so forth. And also I was doing the drumming ceremony that I talked of earlier. So gradually, it seemed forever, but eventually the well took on a little more light, and it was eventually a bottoming out.